All right, Archbishop, how are you doing tonight?
Well, the machines are working.
All right. Hey, so it's that time again, our last session. I know everybody's going to be upset, but time for you to take off.
All right. Last week we got to the third quarter of the 19th century, and we're looking at the period that brings about the resolution, more or less, of the conflict between Anglo-Catholic and other groups within the Church of England. Basically, the final episode in the ritual persecutions that have been so much a feature of the third quarter of the 19th century was the attempted prosecution of the Bishop of Lincoln, Edward King, for ritual offences in 1889. The basic things under question were the use of Eucharistic vestments, the eastward position at the Eucharist, the use of the mixed chalice, the singing of the Agnus Dei, and the use of the cross in absolution and benediction. And whereas previous ritual questions had been packed off to the good old court of wills, wives, and wrecks, this one was put in to the Archbishop's Court of Delegates, which was rather inelegantly described by the then Lord Chief Justice as being an archbishop sitting in his library. And as a result of this, there was a very different procedure in process when it came to the court. The Archbishop chose 3 other bishops as his assessors, one of whom was Bishop Stubbs of Oxford, who was a learned historian. And the procedure was to examine the current law of the Church of England in relation to its original context. And basically what happened was that on 4 of the 5 counts, Bishop King was acquitted. So, and the only one on which he was brought up a little bit short was the use of the cross in absolution and blessing, which the Archbishop could find no evidence of in surviving manuscript sources. So this basically said that a moderate form of ceremonial was permissible in the Church of England, and that the ornaments rubric was to be taken seriously even where it did not comport with the letter of the 1604 canons. This basically results in a truce when it comes to ritual prosecutions, and both sides, the Anglo-Catholics and the Evangelicals, basically have to go back to advancing their cause through the ordinary means of parish ministry, parachurch groups, all that sort of thing. And although it takes the heat out of the situation with regards to ritual prosecutions, there's still a very lively rivalry between evangelicals and Anglo-Catholics in the Church of England as we pass from the 19th century into the 20th. Now, there's quite a significant turnaround in the composition of the House of Bishops around 1900. Queen Victoria's bishops, for the most part, had been liberal and Protestant, although most of her prime ministers from Sir Robert Peel onwards had contrived some sort of a balanced ticket. So there would be some definite middle-of-the-road guys, some definite high churchmen, some definite evangelicals, but no one party was in control. However, the lengthy period in the 1890s where the Conservative administration of Lord Salisbury was in control of appointments saw the southern province in particular tipping more and more towards a Catholic complexion. However, the northern province remained much more evangelical. So you have J.C. Ryle at Liverpool, you have Stanton Dumiel Stanton at Sodor and Man. The Bishop of Carlisle is an evangelical. It's much more equally balanced in the north. The Queen's preferences in terms of churchmanship seem to come out most with regards to the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The last two Archbishops of Canterbury under Queen Victoria are both men of whom she heartily approved. The first is Archbishop Benson. I always get him and his son confused. Benson was a mild high churchman, but someone who had always been acceptable in court circles because of his commitment to higher education and the empire. He was succeeded in 1897 by Frederick Temple, the old headmaster of rugby, who at the age of 77 found himself translated from the relatively quiet diocese of Exeter, where he'd succeeded the old firebrand Henry Philpotts, from the Diocese of London, where he'd succeeded Bishop Jackson, to Canterbury. And he seems to have regarded Canterbury as something as a rest after London. Temple represented the sort of moderate liberalism represented by essays and reviews. He was a contemporary of Baden-Powell, of Jowett, the Master of Balliol, and others who had first acquainted English readerships with the ideas of higher biblical criticism as it applied to the Old Testament. Temple was very much in the liberal Protestant side of the Church of England, and as such he had the warm approval of Queen Victoria. He died more or less literally on the floor of the House of Lords in 1901 and was succeeded by Randall Davidson. Davidson was part of that adage that seems to have kicked around in the 19th century, that if you wanted to run the Church of England properly, you put in a Scot. Davidson was of Scots ancestry. He went to Oxford, presumably to lose his Scottish accent, and had circulated around a series of well-placed livings in the south of England. He was one of the chaplains to the top 10,000, as it were, of the period. And he found himself rapidly promoted from the Diocese of Rochester to the Diocese of Winchester and then on to Canterbury in 1894, 1897 and 1902, respectively. Davidson was a shrewd operator. He had been Archibald Campbell Tate's chaplain, another Scot, and he had been very careful to position himself as being acceptable to both sides. Theologically, he was mildly liberal. He was certainly on the Protestant side of the Church of England, but not in such a way as would offend Anglo-Catholics. But one problem that seriously inhibited his 26 years as Archbishop of Canterbury was his political acumen was greater than his ability to lead the church. Hensley Henson, that acute and uncompromising critic of his episcopal contemporaries, described the Archbishop as being in the habit of prophylactic verbiage, so qualifying any statement that he made that by the end of it you were unsure whether he'd said anything at all. Henson certainly is one of the more interesting figures, and I'll come back to him later. Davidson guided the Church of England from 1902 to 1928, and in the most part, he did a fairly good job of maintaining the ceasefire that had broken out during Archbishop Benson's time. Certainly, he saw that representative members of the Anglo-Catholic and evangelical parties appeared in the episcopate on a regular basis. He seems to have had a hand in the appointment of Francis Chavasse to the Diocese of Liverpool and also of E.A. Knox to the Diocese of Manchester in 1906. He may also have had a hand in the promotion of Hanley Moore to the See of Durham in 1901, just before he became Archbishop of Canterbury. And so you can see Davidson as trying to maintain the very delicate balance between the Catholic and evangelical impulses within the Church of England. Davidson himself does not seem to have had a definite vision for where the Church of England was to go. He looked at each problem in isolation. He reached his decisions based on what he considered to be the best possible solution for the Church of England. Although that could be criticised along the lines of his guiding policy was the phrase, "It'll see my time out." And this sort of pragmatism, whilst very useful in the short term, probably led to the greatest failure of his leadership, which was the failure of prayer book revision in England, both in the 1927 and the 1928 sessions of Parliament. Also, earlier in his episcopate, Randall Davidson had made the decision to support increased self-government for the church. Now, this was an era in which two ongoing controversies were basically raging in the background. The first of which was the precise relationship between the Crown and the Scottish Kirk. And this was not to be resolved until 1927 and the reunion between the Free Church of Scotland and the Kirk to produce the United Church of Scotland. And this period is one in which the relationship between state and church in Scotland is very unclear, because Scotland uniquely has a majority of the population not members of the established church. The Free Church was bigger than the established Kirk at the end of the 19th century. The two sides were eventually brought back together by the simple expedient of compromise. The Free Church's insistence on congregations being free to elect their ministers was eventually allowed by the Kirk. Similarly, the Free Church's more rigorous evangelical stance was relaxed somewhat in favour of a more mainline Presbyterianism. Similarly, the other unresolved question was the status of the 4 Anglican dioceses in Wales. Now, this may not seem like a particular hot potato in the context of early 21st century politics, but in the early 20th century, with Asquith and Lloyd George both occupying senior positions in the government, this was a very hot potato indeed. The majority of the Welsh were nonconformists. As you remember, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the unfortunate decision of the Bishop of St. David's, which drove the majority of Welsh evangelicals out of the church in Wales into the nonconformist sects. And this had come round in the course of the 19th century to a position where only about 25% of the population of Wales were members of the established church. So disestablishment was very much on the cards, particularly when one of the influential people in the Liberal Party was David Lloyd George, who had a Welsh Baptist background, even though if he had to fill in a box when it came to religion in adult life, he would have written agnostic. But like most good Welshmen, even though he was not a good chapel goer himself, he certainly supported the interests of Welsh nonconformity. And so there is a recurring theme to the Liberal administrations between 1906 and 1921, apart from a brief suspension of hostilities during World War I, which is that on a regular basis, the issue of the disestablishment of the church in Wales is brought forwards. Now, the majority of English bishops resisted this because they saw it as being the precursor to the disendowment and disestablishment of the Church of England. Certainly that was the basis upon which Randall Davidson opposed it. However, there's no denying that by the 1910s, something had to be done about the position of the Church of England in Wales. Unfortunately, what was done fulfilled the forebodings not just of the enemies of disestablishment, but also those who worried about the whole issue of church self-government. Because when the church in Wales was disestablished in 1920-21, all rights of private patronage were extinguished, which led to the virtual disappearance of the evangelical party in the church in Wales, because the existing bishops were, for the most part, either Anglo-Catholics or liberals. And as a result of this, the church in Wales today is very monochromatic and is declining rapidly towards extinction, because the liberal Catholic hegemony in the church in Wales has tended to push the church more in a liberal direction than in a Catholic direction. From my point of view, it's probably best to look at the 1910s, the 1920s, and the 1930s through a pair of interlocked careers. I've already mentioned Herbert Hensley Henson. The other name I'm going to throw out there is William Cosmo Gordon Lang. The two of them were born not quite a year and a half apart. Sorry, not quite a year apart. Henson was born in November 1863 and Lang in August 1864. Henson was born to a middle-class family in London. His father was an active member of the Plymouth Brethren. His mother died when he was 6 years old. His father remarried, allegedly, though there is no legal record of the marriage in 1873, and it was Henson's stepmother who ensured that Henson got the education his father feared would corrupt him. Henson's stepmother also ensured that he was finally given permission to be baptized at the age of 14 into the established church. He didn't have godparents. He took the vows normally associated with godparents on himself, and he, at that point in his life, was looking for a way to get out of home. So he accepted a job as an usher, which is a kind of trainee teacher, at Brigg Grammar School in Lincolnshire. And from there he went to Oxford as an unattached student reading modern history. Cosmo Gordon Lang, by contrast, was a son of the Manse, born in Fyvie Manse in Aberdeenshire about 9 months after Henson. By contrast to Henson, his father, as a well-placed minister within the established Kirk of Scotland, he was later minister of the Barony Kirk in Glasgow, was able to give Lang a conventional middle-class upbringing, which included matriculating at the University of Glasgow at the age of 14. From Glasgow he went on to Oxford, and he graduated again, we're looking at another modern historian, in 1886, 2 years after Henson. Now, whereas Henson had been a tosher, that's an unattached student, and also a troglodyte, which is a man who keeps to his books and does not go out in company very much, Lang had been a member of OUDS, the Oxford University Drama Society, and a keen member of the Oxford Union. And as such, he was a well-known figure in the university, particularly in conservative political circles. He represented the liberal wing of the Conservative Party. But both of them were drawn irresistibly towards the ministry of the Church of England. Henson was ordained about a year ahead of Lang, and they both had similar experiences of a direct call from God to the service of his church. Henson recalls the event as taking place in St Mary's Church, Iffley. Lang's took place a few miles away in the parish church at Cuddeston, which was attached to the theological college. And in their early life, both as university students and as ministers, their paths were very similar. Lang tried for a fellowship of All Souls and didn't get it. Henson tried for a fellowship of All Souls and got it. Lang was ordained and went to a slum parish in the north of England. He went to Leeds Parish Church. From Leeds Parish Church, he briefly was chaplain of Magdalen College, Oxford, before becoming vicar of the University Church in Oxford, before moving on to the great industrial slums of Portsmouth. Hensley Henson went back to his native London and was vicar of Barking during the 1890s until his health failed and he became chaplain of a hospital in Ilford. By hospital, I mean almshouse in this context. It was whilst he was at the almshouse that Hensley Henson went on one of his rigorous programs of self-education. Henson, more than any other figure in the early 20th century Church of England, was a self-made man. His father had gone bankrupt whilst Henson was at Oxford. And as a result of this, Henson, out of his slender stipend as a Fellow of All Souls, had been supporting his siblings back in the family home in Broadstairs in Kent. Henson was a man of no particular background. His father had been a businessman who retired too early and then proceeded to live beyond his means. His grandfather had been a carter in Somerset. Lang's family, by contrast, had a long history in the ministry of the Church of Scotland. And by 1900, Lang had become the leader of, or one of the leaders of, the liberal Catholic school in the Church of England, whereas Henson increasingly aligned with the liberal Protestant side in the Church of England. Interestingly, they had the same patron, Lord Salisbury. Lord Salisbury eventually promoted Lang to be Bishop of Stepney at the unheard of early age of 37, whilst Henson, a year older, became rector of St Margaret's, Westminster, which is the church next to the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Abbey, and a canon of Westminster Abbey. And as such, Henson used his pulpit in Westminster to address controversial topics, to espouse a liberal Protestant view of Christianity, and generally to stir things up a bit. One of the things that was almost a regular part of Abbey life during 1902 to 1903 were the regular rows between Hensley Henson and Charles Gore. Charles Gore was very much the patron of the liberal Catholic school, the Lux Mundi group to which Lang belonged. And for some reason, he had a knack for antagonizing Henson, and Henson, in return, had a knack for antagonizing Charles Gore. Something approaching peace broke out when Charles Gore became the Bishop of Oxford. As a result of Henson being in Westminster, you have throughout the next 40 years a very individual record of the inner workings of the Church of England. Henson was an inveterate journal scribbler, and volume after volume after volume of his journal survives, often heavily edited by Henson himself, but it's a unique individual record of the inner workings of the Church of England from 1902 through to his retirement in 1939, and a little beyond that during his wartime ministry at Westminster Abbey. And Henson becomes a trenchant critic of the attempts to loosen the ties between the Church of England and the state. Henson and Lang's careers are intertwined until 1902. Even in the Edwardian period, from 1902 to 1910, Lang is one of the popular preachers in London, so is Henson. The two of them are perpetually preaching to full churches, presenting their own particular outlook. Lang increasingly sees the future of the Church of England in terms of an ongoing Catholic revival, a more arm's length relationship with the state. He encourages moves such as the creation of a church assembly. He also encourages a greater amount of church government on the local level. Whereas Hensleigh Henson, usually supported by more than adequate statistical evidence, tends to dismiss the whole business as a farce. The interplay of these two characters is one that it becomes one of the key relationships in the 20th century Church of England, because Henson's criticisms of the Church of England, as he saw it in his day, have an uncanny knack of being prophecy. So that when, at the time of the passage of the Enabling Act in 1918, which created parochial church councils to replace the old vestries, which increased the powers of the church assembly, Henson criticized it on the basis that the franchise was confirmation, not baptism. And he prophesied that with a confirmation franchise for voting in the Church of England, it would increasingly become a middle-class Anglo-Catholic leaning sect. And if you look at the Church of England today, it's a liberal Anglo-Catholic leaning sect that's also become very liberal in the last 35 years. Henson's uncanny accuracy shouldn't disguise us to the fact that he was an eccentric. Henson never found an established orthodoxy that he didn't want to turn upside down and shake and see if any bits fell off. He was one of those men with a mind that was always questing for absolute truth. And unlike Lang, who swam easily up the ladder of preferment between 1902 and 1908, 1900 and 1908, Henson found himself dead-ended, first at Westminster Abbey and then as Dean of Durham between 1912 and 1918. The reason for this, undoubtedly, was Henson's ability to offend people in high places in the church, such as Charles Gore, who was Bishop first of Oxford, then of Worcester. Lang swung against him after Henson embraced the Protestant cause around 1900. Davidson was not particularly fond of him because Henson was a little bit prone to making very accurate but also very outrageous statements. When the House of Commons did its best to cover up the Anglo-Amazonian Rubber Company scandal in 1912, Henson blasted the whole thing wide open from the pulpit of Westminster Abbey, much to the embarrassment of the government. Hensleigh Henson's accomplice in this, by the way, was Sir Roger Casement, who was later shot for treason following the Easter Rising in 1916 in Ireland. But Henson undoubtedly had righteousness on his side. The treatment of the Amazonian natives was absolutely despicable. Henson finally was moved to Durham in 1912, having been considered for Lincoln in 1910. And there's an apocryphal story that circulates about him being considered for York in 1908. The story goes that his name was suggested to Edward VII, who is reported to have replied to the Prime Minister, "Damn it all, man, I am defender of the faith." Henson's reputation for unorthodoxy followed him to Durham, but there's no doubt he became very popular in the Diocese of Durham, not so much for his theological views, but for his accuracy in diagnosing what was wrong in contemporary society. In 1918, he became Bishop of Hereford. By this time, Lang had been 10 years Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was one of those who protested the election of Henson as Bishop of Hereford. He rather pointedly stayed away from his friend's consecration. Henson himself proved to be an extremely efficient, if somewhat eccentric, bishop. He was translated from Hereford to Durham in 1920, and he handled that great industrial diocese all the way through the industrial depression of the 1920s. Lang, on the other hand, was translated to York and had his own share of misfortune. Lang, despite his early ministry amongst the poor, very much became a chaplain to the top 10,000 after he was translated to York. And he seemed to have the gift of bad timing. For example, preaching a sermon in the closing months of 1914, recollecting fondly that the Kaiser had attended Queen Victoria on her deathbed, was not likely to win you many friends at the beginning of the Great War. He was to do a similar number following the abdication of Edward VIII in December 1936, where he seemed to be kicking a man when he was down. Lang was definitely an ecclesiastical statesman, and sometimes the statesman dominated the ecclesiastic with unfortunate results. Lang, of course, enthusiastically supported the move towards church self-government, the Enabling Act of 1919 being the high watermark of a movement which took the regulation of the Church of England's day-to-day life away from Parliament and the bishops and put it into the hand of that unlovely body, the Church Assembly. The main problem with the Church Assembly is that it was the province of professional committee sitters, the people with the money and the leisure to indulge in that particular variety of public service. And as a result of this, the Church Assembly, in its successor, the General Synod of the Church of England, has always been rather unrepresentative of the Church of England as a whole. It tends to be both more liberal and more Anglo-Catholic and more upper middle class than the average run of people in the pews. And it tends to legislate along those lines. A typical instance of this is the great controversy that arose over the revision of the 1662 Prayer Book. In 1906, the Royal Commission on the Worship of the Church of England had reported that the existing law regarding worship in the Church of England was too narrow for present-day needs, and this began the slow process of reform. From the point of view of its academic background and the scholarship that guided the revision, you really can't fault the English 1928. You've got people like W.H. Frere involved, who was one of the foremost liturgiologists of the day. And the book that they produced was a masterpiece. The only trouble was it did not command the uncritical approval of the laity. And as such, when it was put to Parliament in 1927, the measure was defeated by 238 votes to 206. The following year, it was defeated again by 262 votes to 238. And this double denial of a revision of the prayer book was a grave blow to Randall Davidson, who retired as Archbishop of Canterbury at the end of 1928, and also to the House of Bishops. Henson, who, being Henson, did things for his own good reasons. Having seen a Labour government come into power, flips his position on disestablishment and becomes one of its foremost proponents for the remainder of his time as Bishop of Durham. It's basically he didn't trust the Labour Party with church patronage. The other bishops kind of waffled and decided that the best way in which to deal with the crisis in church-state relationships was to defer the whole thing by the simple expedient of saying they were not going to prosecute anybody for using the 1928 prayer book. So although the legal standard remained the 1662, in practice an increasing number of parishes used the 1928 prayer book. But what was it exactly that killed the 1928 prayer book? The simple answer are two related issues: perpetual reservation of the Blessed Sacrament and communion of the sick. The general religious tone in England from the 17th century to the middle of the 20th century was vigorously Protestant. And as such, perpetual reservation of the Blessed Sacrament was unacceptable to a wide range of public opinion. And although the bishops were very careful to say that it was specifically to communicate those who could not get to church, it still aroused the good old cry of no popery. And as such, a group which Hensley Henson described with his usual wit as the Protestant underworld, he was probably thinking of his father when he used that description, roused themselves to action and threw together an ad hoc alliance of English evangelicals, Scottish Presbyterians and Welsh nonconformists, underpinned by a goodly number of Ulster Orangemen, to defeat the prayer book on both occasions. It was not lost on Hensley Henson that had it not been for the votes from the Celtic fringe, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the prayer book would have passed in 1927. And as a result of this, there's a very real crisis in the relationship between church and state in the 1930s. The only trouble is nobody wants to deal with it. Cosmo Gordon Lang, upon Davidson's retirement in 1928, is translated from York to Canterbury. York is filled by William Temple, who was one of the great philosophical minds of the Church of England in the 20th century. Much neglected nowadays. His works, Mens Creatorix, and basically his work needs re-examining. He comes from the same liberal Catholic tradition as Charles Gore. But he was one of those who incorporated the basic ideas of socialism into a basically Catholic theology. So he's one of the founders of a workable Catholic socialism within the Church of England. And that's the school of thought that most Church of England bishops today come from. Temple was the son of Frederick Temple, who had been Archbishop of Canterbury at the turn of the century. He had a first in Greats from Oxford, a very keen mind. He'd been headmaster of Rugby. He was preferred as Bishop of Manchester at the age of only 40, in succession to the dour and Protestant E.A. Knox. Temple was everlastingly good-humoured. He was a strong proponent of total abstinence from alcohol, which no doubt drew a certain amount of sarcasm from Hensley Henson. And he was regarded as being, the great hope of the Church of England in the 1920s and 1930s. He's one of the few bishops who is a sound philosopher and a sound theologian at the professional level, and also someone who is internationally regarded. The problem with Temple is that he underestimated the ability of society to not be fixed. And one has the general feeling, reading Temple's work today, that he fits very neatly into the rather optimistic context of the 1920s and the 1930s, the theological atmosphere that produced the American Prayer Book of 1928, which shares that sort of liberal Catholic optimism. Henson, of course, was at Durham. E.S. Talbot, the former warden of Keble College, goes to Winchester. The Bishop of London is Winnington Ingram, who was a real loser. And the basic structure of the Church of England is that 4 out of 5 of the senior sees are held by Anglo-Catholics, which may explain the trenchant nature of some of Henson's criticisms, being the only Protestant amongst the top 5. The result of their deliberations over the 1928 prayer book was essentially to give up. The 1928 prayer book passed into unofficial use. The bishops postponed the whole issue of readjusting the relationship between the Church of England and the Houses of Parliament. Through the 1930s, of course, nothing could be done during the 1940s because of the war and reconstruction that followed it. And it was well into the 1950s before the matter was finally sorted out through basically legislating a perpetual truce into existence, whereby Parliament gave the Church of England permission to produce its own alternative liturgies, although you try finding the official liturgy these days, it can be pretty difficult, and was left free to make most of its own decisions. In some senses, this continued relationship between church and state has come back to bite the Orthodox in the Church of England, in that there was a considerable parliamentary push between 2007 and 2012 to allow women bishops in the Church of England. Similarly, back in the 1990s, there was pressure from Parliament to allow women priests at a point when the General Synod was still somewhat hesitant. Where does this leave the Church of England? Well, the Church of England's glory basically departed with the Enabling Act, which narrowed it from being a national church to being very largely the plaything of a Catholic-leaning middle-class elite. Increasingly, the Church of England has lost touch with the working class. It's increasingly lost touch with the lower middle class, which tended to lean towards traditional nonconformity anyway. Liberal theology has displaced orthodoxy. So as things stand today, the Church of England is balanced on a knife edge. It could go with the parish clergy and with the many good conservative evangelical and conservative Catholic priests that there are in the Church of England. And it could once again become a living Christian presence in England. On the other hand, it could go, and increasingly seems to be going, with the quasi-liberalist, the quasi-establishment, the liberal elite that gathers around church houses and wherever 2 or 3 people are gathered together to form a committee. Certainly since 1974 and the foundation of the Crown Appointments Commission, most episcopal appointments have been, shall we say, lacking in imagination. It certainly took considerable lobbying on the part of the Diocese of London to get first Graham Leonard, then David Hope, and finally Richard Charters as their bishop to continue the strong conservative and Catholic-leaning tradition in that diocese. Although I will notice that the grey suits have got their revenge by appointing a woman this time round. who's known to be a strong liberal. But she'll respect divergent points of view. Similarly, the last 5 archbishops of Canterbury have all been a bit lacking. Williams did not have the experience of the English church to be able to deal adequately with the tensions between evangelical and liberals. George Carey basically was put in because he approved of women priests. Runcie was famously summed up with Gary Bennett's comment, the Archbishop represents a liberal Catholic approach to doctrine in the Church of England, and we would not take too much notice of the former epithet. Coggan became Archbishop of Canterbury too late in life to have much effect, and unfortunately Michael Ramsey was another appointment which proved the adage that a great man can become Archbishop of Canterbury without being a great Archbishop of Canterbury. And as such, the Church of England has tottered on under less than inspiring leadership. But I want to conclude tonight with 2 funnies, and they both come from Hensley Henson. In 1926, Cosmo Gordon Lang had his portrait painted by Sir William Orpen, who was the leading English portraitist of the time. And when he showed it to Henson, he says, I'm rather worried that this portrait makes me look proud, pompous, and prelatical. And Henson, sharp as a whip as usual, turned and says, Your Grace, to which of the 3 epithets do you take exception? Another one of Hensley Henson's comments was when the extremely liberal Bishop of Birmingham, Bishop Barnes, arrived late at a meeting in Lambeth Palace. There were no longer any chairs available for him in the circle around the fire in the palace library, and he looked at Barnes, lifted one eyebrow and said, My dear Barnes, you must anticipate the judgment of the church and go sit on the fire. And that neatly illustrates, in some respects, the dilemma of the Church of England, caught between its liberal and its Catholic heritages. And unfortunately, the solution to the problem increasingly has been to clothe a liberal theology in a Catholic ritual to produce a religion that is unable to capture the soul of England. Okay, that's it.
Holy mackerel, you better write that down. No, that was the best summary I've ever, out of everything. If you could just summarize where we all have been, the Episcopal Church, the Church of England, that really, the liberalism trying to encapsulate the, I don't even know how you put it now, the Catholic soul of the church. That really captured the whole thing of summarizing where we are today.
The American church actually has it worse because there's no evangelical opposition worth talking about over here until the 1980s. Because evangelicalism as a movement in the Church of England is, in the Episcopal Church, is very much on life support from 1900 through to the 1980s. There's a few isolated figures such as Sam Schumacher at Calvary in New York City, who was one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. But very generally, in the Episcopal Church, you have liberal evangelicalism and you have Anglo-Catholicism. And the two cross-pollinate to produce the sort of high and wide approach that has become characteristic of the Episcopal Church, especially since 1979.
So, you know, talking about, I think we kind of touched on this a little bit last week, but just kind of touch in, because I have it on my bookshelf. Well, I have it as one of my several ones on the bookshelf, but I have the Anglican Missal, which basically came out, we saw this movement for the 28 prayer book, and then that kind of the Anglican missal came to America, and then the Americans decided to have the American missal, which is the ACC. How did it really take off that dramatically in England, the missal, or was it just you talk to the Anglo-Catholics and you sound like it was a major movement in England.
The trouble is Anglo-Catholics have very limited vision. And their vision tends to stop 10 feet outside the Catholic movement. Anglo-Catholic parishes were never more than 1 in 10 in the Church of England. And you're looking at a gradient. Anglo-Catholicism was nicknamed after a long-defunct railway company, the London and Brighton and South Coast Religion. So it's basically strongest in a triangle between London, Dover, and Southampton. If you go to the north of England, maybe 1 parish in 50 use the missal. And they tended to be concentrated in the industrial cities like Grimsby, Leeds, Hull, Middlesbrough, Newcastle, where there had been a rash of mid-Victorian church building. Where I'm from in rural Lincolnshire, nobody knew what a missal was, except something the Roman Catholics used.
Well, the one that I got comes from England.
Church, you use the prayer book.
Yeah, and I've never really been able. I tried to look it up, and I think I found it. But it's the Bishop of Lewes or LEW something is what I came up with. You know where that is? Lewes.
Yes.
Yes, that's who this missal belonged to, and somehow it made it in America, and then it made it on eBay.
Yeah. The missals weren't very big in England. Most of us used the prayer book, even if you were on the Anglo-Catholic side of the church. The enduring book amongst the moderate Anglo-Catholics was very much the 1928 prayer book. The proposal that never made it. Then in the 1960s, they started adopting the alternative liturgies. Evangelicals tended to stick to the 1662. Central churchmen, who were really the old Protestant high churchmen, which is essentially my background, they used the prayer book with very, very, very little alteration. We might leave out the 10 Commandments and use the summary of the law or the Kyrie on ordinary Sundays, but, warts and all, we still use the 1662. Most parishes still had morning prayer as the main service well into the 1960s. So the Anglo-Catholics do tend to exaggerate their own importance. Also, Anglo-Catholics do tend to produce an unusually large number of church historians. And, there is the old joke, history is usually written by the victors. Or in this case, church history is usually written from a partisan point of view. There's very few who are magisterially detached. Moorman comes pretty close, even though he was a committed Anglo-Catholic.
The other question kind of relates to the modern day English church, because I've read on several occasions, and then even David Virtue wrote, it was last year sometime. He was in England, went to a small country parish, and he said the name, and I forget, but it was a famous area. And he walked in, there was a woman minister, there was nobody in the church, and he couldn't even recognize it as an Anglican service. He said they didn't even use the 62 or anything resemblance of any Anglican service. They had something going on there.
Yeah.
And I've read that on several other occasions. that there's no conformity anymore to the 62, and there's all these alternative services. Is there really any solid prayer book or definition as the English church today as to the usage?
Increasingly not. The difficulty is that you have with common worship, which is the current alternative liturgy, it's really, there's nothing common about it. It's a common set of resources from which every parish, in an almost congregational way, extracts its own particular order of worship. Now, in large parts of England, if you look for it, you can still find the prayer book. The old parish church back home still uses the Book of Common Prayer in the evening. Same goes for Beverley Minster across the river, which also has the advantages of having some good solid biblical preaching. But in a lot of parishes where there's only a morning service, what you're very likely to get is a service of the word, which is kind of looks like something that got dragged out your local Presbyterian place, alternating with parish communion, which is basically a watered-down version of the Roman Rite, with nothing particularly consciously Anglican about any of it, particularly if the minister's taking the service in a pair of chinos and a woolly jumper.
Well, yeah, and I had a friend of mine went to a church there, and he said the guy just showed up, and he was in a collar, and it was like, didn't even recognize it as a big church. He said there was a couple hundred people in there, but you couldn't even recognize it as an Anglican service. You see, he felt like it was more like something the American Episcopal Church had done, and then he said, at least the American Church 79 is something Anglican. What he did there, he said, was so washed down, he couldn't quite figure out what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is in the late 80s, when I was moving towards ordination, the evangelicals, the Anglo-Catholics, and the liberals had all pretty much got it together on liturgy. So increasingly, the evangelicals were using the alternative liturgy, in those days the old ASB Rite A, as the main Sunday morning service when they had communion as the main service. The other Sundays they would use ASB morning prayer. The more Catholic places would use the ASB service, communion service every Sunday as the main service. There was a large element of commonality there. But as the charismatic movement has taken hold with its cry of basically for spurious freedom, they've increasingly wanted to tailor-make services, for example, for seekers, for young professionals, for it's every group has to have a liturgy made for it. They've lost the idea of common prayer, where young and old, rich and poor, male and female join in the liturgy as a common endeavor to the glory of God. And as such, you have a massive fragmentation of the liturgical life of the Church of England.
All right, well, I don't want to take up all the questions. I know some other people probably got some.
Sorry for the background noise, but if you can hear me, I just have a quick question about the term of Christian socialism that Moorman uses, and how does that relate to, I mean, is he talking about first century living in common, or is he talking about social justice, or is he talking about people reading Marx? And I couldn't quite figure out when he's saying this Christian socialism movement really gets into the church. It's just a little bit
basically coming at it from the angle of the Christian Social Union in the late 19th century, which saw socialism as accurately diagnosing what was wrong with society and providing a program to ameliorate it. What it attempted to do, the basic fault of socialism is it has no concept of original sin. And what the Catholic or Christian socialists tried to do was to put socialist concepts of social justice into a Christian context in order to provide, first of all, a coherent Christian approach to social issues, and secondly, to solve the problems inherent in socialism where it ignores the whole concept of original sin. That's really what Moorman is getting at. The key figures in Christian socialism early in the 20th century would be Charles Gore, Cuthbert Adderley, Percy Dearmer, William Temple, basically the whole group that surrounds they're involved with Life and Liberty, they're involved with TOC H, and a whole host of parachurch organizations which lean towards this sort of moderate socialist approach to questions of how the church deals with social issues. Opposing them were people like Hensley Henson, who come from an old-fashioned liberal background, who believe that a properly regulated free market will eventually create enough wealth to haul most people out of abject poverty, but that any sort of deliberate church intervention in social policy beyond preaching the gospel is inherently dangerous because it runs the risk of involving the church in issues which ultimately lead it away from its core mission. The third position would be relative radicals like Conrad Noel, who had his Catholic Crusade for Social Justice in the 1920s, which basically wanted to sweep away the existing social order in favor of some sort of church-run communism. So you've got a spectrum there. Moorman basically is going with the central, the center option, where the church favors a moderate socialist approach to social issues. Basically, what you've seen in the Roman Catholic Church since Pope Paul VI and Vatican II.
Dear Grace, I have a question about the Church of England proposed 28 prayer book. What are your thoughts on if any continuing body chose to amend the American 28? Do you think the Church of England 28 is the right place to start from, or go back to the start of 1662?
Well, the English 1928 is theologically somewhat more rigorous than the American 28, in that you do not have wholesale changes to the marriage office, the baptismal office. You don't have the watering down that you have in the American prayer book. But of course, watering down with the American prayer book doesn't start in 1928, it starts in 1789. And in some respects, 1892 is stepping back from the very liberal approach of 1789. But of course, the liberals of the 18th century are a lot different to the liberals of today. America needs to retain its own liturgical tradition, but in some ways it could benefit from looking at the criticisms of the 1789 prayer book that were incorporated into the draft that was put to the 1889 General Convention, which would bring the office, morning and evening prayer, much more in line with 1662. They would bring the marriage service much more into line with 1662, same with the baptismal office, whilst leaving the communion service pretty much untouched. The communion service is probably, apart from one slightly uncomfortable piece of phraseology, is probably the best thing in the 1928. I'd also have a quick plug for the penitential office, but that's me.
Bishop, what's the one part in the communion service particularly that you have a...
Yeah, from an 1892 guy, let's hear your answer on all of that.
The one phrase that sets my teeth on edge because I do not know what they mean comes at the end of the prayer for the church. And it is, beseeching thee to grant them continual growth in thy love and service, and to give us grace so to follow their good examples. What on earth do they mean by continual growth in thy love and service? I mean, it can mean anything from it can mean anything from sort of 1920s wishy-washy sentimentalism about the dead through to purgatory.
Well,
by the way, I think it's vague for just that reason.
What makes that one a little bit tough is when you read in the Epistle to the Hebrews, it says, you've come to the souls of righteous men made perfect. And I've often thought, well, if their souls of the saints in heaven have been made perfect, how can you get more perfect?
Right. That's it just strikes me as sloppy. And I'm sort of death on sloppiness at times. The other thing I don't particularly appreciate in the American book is that 1943 lectionary, but we hashed that one over last week.
Well, it sounds like we're pretty much at a good time. We're at 7:37. Hey, just to let everybody know, I haven't jammed this with the Archbishop yet, because we had because of a certain individual, we had made some plan changes for next semester, and that individual is no longer in the picture. So I will be sending out a notice. I think we're going to go back to the original synopsis of what's going on. I'm going to be teaching the Apocrypha for our first semester. If that's still all right with the Archbishop, I think we were going to go another route, but I think that doesn't need to happen now. And then the Archbishop, most likely in second semester of next year, will be teaching liturgics, liturgical worship. Give him a little time to prep for that course and put that together. The Apocrypha is my strong suit. So I'm already prepped and ready for that course.
And a word of warning about the liturgy course. You need to remember this old joke. What's the difference between a liturgist and a terrorist? You can negotiate with a terrorist.
So I'm going to be sending out an email. We're going to be starting the second week in January. It will be a 12. Our normal semesters run 13 weeks. This one was a little shorter. Next semester will be a 12-week course. The Archbishop's class will probably be a 12-week course with a weekend get-together for a lab on week 13 for those that are pursuing ordination. But I will send out an email to all of our clergy and all those that are on this list, giving an update on what our new schedule is.
Mm-hmm.
Archbishop, if you will finish this out in a great prayer for the holidays.
Well, this is one of those moments where I wish I had the English 1928 to hand.
I'm sure you got it on your bookshelf somewhere.
I've got the Scottish. There it is. English.
And you notice how he memorizes every prayer that's in every prayer book from
No, I
around the
don't. I
world.
memorize very little because my memory's not that good.
Yeah, and he flips right to the page. So, yeah.
Ah, now that's the knack. Don't want page it's on. Actually, what I was thinking of was the Collect for St. Thomas's Day, which I rather prefer the English version to the American on that. And it runs as follows, if they didn't move it. Almighty and ever-living God, who for the more confirmation of the faith did suffer thy holy apostle Thomas to be doubtful in thy Son's resurrection, grant us so perfectly and without all doubt to believe in thy Son, Jesus Christ, that our faith in thy sight may never be reproved. Hear us, O Lord, through the same Jesus Christ, to whom with thee and the Holy Ghost be all honor and glory, now and forevermore. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining our class for this semester.